The storm raged through the narrow streets of Honfleur, a quiet seaside town in France. The rain lashed against the crumbling walls of an old house where a boy sat by a broken window, staring out into the night. His name was Christophe Rocancourt, and though he was just a child, he already knew one thing: poverty would never define him. His father, Daniel Rocancourt, was a painter, but not the kind whose works hung in museums. He was a drifter, a man who spent more time drowning in cheap liquor than holding a paintbrush. His mother, Annick Villers, was barely more than a girl when she had Christophe, and life had left her hardened. She worked the streets when she had to, vanishing for days at a time. Christophe quickly learned that no one was coming to save him. By the time he was 10, he had already perfected the art of survival. He could sneak into bakeries before dawn and slip out with a loaf of bread without a sound. He knew which vendors would turn their backs at the market and which ones had eyes in the back of their heads. But even in the midst of hunger, even as he curled up in the corner of a cold, empty room, he never let go of a single thought. I was meant for more than this. He became obsessed with stories of princes and tycoons, of men who wore fine suits and lived in grand mansions. He didn't just want to admire them. He wanted to become one of them. And if life wasn't going to give him that chance, he'd take it for himself. The first time he saw a rich man up close, he was 14. A black Mercedes rolled through the streets of Honfleur, its windows gleaming under the streetlights. Christophe watched as the driver stepped out and opened the door for a man in a tailored suit. The man barely glanced at anyone as he strode into a high-end restaurant, his shoes clicking against the pavement. That night, Christophe made a decision. He wouldn't just dream about a different life. He would step into it, one lie at a time, and no one would ever see it coming. The streets of Honfleur were no place for a boy with dreams larger than his pockets. Christophe Rocancourt knew this. At 15, he had already perfected his ability to slip into places he didn't belong, but he wanted more than scraps and shadows. He wanted to be seen. His first real con wasn't planned. He was watching a wealthy tourist at a cafe, a man who wore an expensive watch and spoke about his business dealings with the arrogance of someone who never knew hunger. Christophe, now tall and confident despite his ragged clothes, walked right up to him. "You're French?" he asked in flawless Parisian dialect. The man raised an eyebrow, taken aback. "My father knew your company," Christophe continued, his expression unreadable. "In fact, he invested in it years ago. That's why I recognized you. But you wouldn't know me. I was just a child then." It was a bold claim, completely fabricated, but Christophe watched as the man hesitated. He wasn't sure if it was true. And that's when Christophe understood the power of certainty. If he believed his own lie, so would everyone else. By the end of their conversation, the businessman handed Christophe some money for a meal, offering a polite nod as he left. To him, it was nothing, an act of generosity toward a boy who had fallen on hard times. To Christophe, it was proof. If a single conversation could open doors, then words were the ultimate weapon. He refined his skills quickly. He studied people, how they walked, how they dressed, how they spoke. He picked up accents, learned names, memorized details from newspapers about the world's elite. He practiced shaking hands like a man with power, tilting his head just enough to seem interested without appearing desperate. Then, at 17, he pulled off his first major deception. In Paris, he found an abandoned mansion that had once belonged to an aristocratic family. It was empty, forgotten, but Christophe made it his own. He created fake ownership documents, forged a title, and sold the property to an unsuspecting investor for over $1 million. It was an audacious scam, the kind that could have landed him in prison. But Christophe? He simply disappeared, taking the money with him. And that's when he knew. This was only the beginning. The world didn't belong to the rich. It belonged to the people who could convince others that they were rich. With a fake identity in hand and no ties holding him back, Christoph boarded a ship to America. He was going to become someone important, someone unstoppable. New York City was a jungle of ambition, a place where wealth and power walked the streets without a second thought. Christoph Rocancourt arrived with nothing but his wits and an unshakable belief that he could rewrite his destiny. The first lesson he learned in America was that the rich didn't question success. They assumed it. A man in a tailored suit could walk into any room and be accepted. So, Christoph made sure he looked the part. With a portion of his stolen money, he dressed himself in luxury. Armani suits, Rolex watches, the right cologne, the right haircut. But it wasn't just about appearances. He studied the elite. He learned their language, their habits, their weaknesses. And when he stepped into their world, he was no longer Christoph Rocancourt, the boy from Honfleur. He was Christopher de Laurentius, a self-made millionaire, an heir to a fortune. The name was carefully chosen. Hollywood producer Dino De Laurentiis was a real figure, a name whispered in powerful circles. By claiming to be part of his dynasty, Christoph never had to prove anything. People simply believed. And once they believed, they opened their doors. Christoph slipped effortlessly into the high society of Los Angeles, New York, and the Hamptons. He attended elite parties with celebrities, models, and businessmen. The secret was confidence. He never asked for favors. He expected them. He never seemed eager. He made others feel like they were lucky to be in his presence. And soon, he was living in mansions he didn't own, driving cars he never bought, and spending money he never earned. It wasn't just about stealing from the rich. Christoph had realized something much more dangerous. The wealthy want to believe in success stories. If you told them the right story, if you spoke their language, they would invest in you, hand over money, offer you opportunities. They would fund their own deception. Under different names, Christoph convinced investors to fund non-existent film projects. He played poker with Hollywood actors, boasting about imaginary bank accounts. He borrowed millions from those who assumed he would pay them back. He was even invited to exclusive business deals, with real billionaires treating him as an equal. They never checked. They never doubted. And why would they? He looked just like them. For years, the illusion held. But every great con has a flaw. It relies on people never asking too many questions. And in 1997, someone did. A businessman who had given Christoph a large sum of money began to suspect something was wrong. He made calls, checked records, and found nothing. No real investments, no inherited fortune. Just a ghost. A man who had created himself from thin air. And now, the chase was on. Law enforcement started to notice him. Investors began to whisper. But Christoph wasn't afraid. If they wanted to catch him, they would have to outthink him. And no one had ever outplayed him before. The first time Christoph Rocancourt realized the walls were closing in, he was lounging by a rooftop pool in Beverly Hills, sipping a cocktail he hadn't paid for. A man he once borrowed money from, a venture capitalist with a sharp nose for fraud, was asking questions. Too many questions. But Christoph didn't panic. He never panicked. Instead, he did what he always did best. He disappeared. The moment he felt the heat, Christoph changed identities like a chameleon shedding its skin. One day, he was Christopher de Laurentiis, Hollywood investor. The next, he was Prince Galitzine, a European aristocrat with secret wealth. By the time his former victims realized he had vanished, he was already in another city, forging another empire of lies. Los Angeles became Las Vegas, then Miami, then New York. Each city brought new opportunities, new marks, millionaires eager to invest in his grandiose, non-existent ventures. He was careful. He never stayed in one place too long. He never left a trail that could be traced easily. If someone got suspicious, he charmed them, redirected their attention, or, when necessary, cut and ran. But the game was changing. Law enforcement was starting to connect the dots. And the more his name appeared in whispers, the harder it became to operate in plain sight. So, he took the game international. In 2000, Christophe resurfaced in Canada, under a new alias, Michael Van Hoven, a wealthy European businessman. The playbook was the same: lavish hotels, high-stakes poker games, whispered deals about hidden fortunes. And for a while, it worked. He swindled an elderly couple, promising them access to lucrative investments. He befriended influential figures, slipping effortlessly into high society once again. But Canada was different. Someone recognized him. Someone remembered the French con artist who had been making headlines in the U.S. By 2001, the authorities had him in their sights. They watched. They waited. And when he made a mistake, a small one, a single unpaid bill at a luxury hotel in the Hamptons, they pounced. For the first time in his life, Christophe Rocancourt was in handcuffs. Christophe sat in a cold interrogation room in New York, staring at the detectives who had spent years trying to track him down. "You really thought you'd never get caught?" one of them asked. Christophe smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Who says you caught me?" Because even in custody, he had a plan. He always had a plan. And the greatest trick he had ever pulled? Convincing the world that he was untouchable. Christophe Rocancourt had spent his life weaving a tapestry of lies so intricate that even he sometimes believed them. But now, sitting in a New York jail cell, the illusion was unraveling. The newspapers called him the Great Imposter. The world finally knew his name, not as a billionaire, not as a prince, but as a fraud. Yet, even in custody, Christophe was not defeated. Because if there was one thing he understood better than anyone, it was this: prison bars mean nothing if you control the narrative. The authorities expected fear. They expected panic. They expected a man begging for a deal. But Christophe? He laughed. He charmed the guards, cracked jokes with the detectives, and controlled the story. When the press came knocking, he didn't hide. He gave interviews. He spoke about his past with a mixture of arrogance and amusement, as if the world had been foolish to ever doubt him. "I never stole," he told one journalist with a smirk. "I only took what people were willing to give." And, in a way, it was true. The rich had wanted to believe in him. They had handed him their money, their trust, their admiration. He had simply played their game better than they had. And now, he would do it again, but on a grander scale. By the time his trial came, Christophe knew he wouldn't spend the rest of his life in prison. His lawyers negotiated fiercely. They cut deals. The fraud charges were stacked high, but with limited physical evidence, the prosecution had to rely on testimony from people who had once worshipped him. Christophe pleaded guilty, but not before securing a reduced sentence. Instead of decades behind bars, he got just under 5 years. And even while imprisoned, his legend only grew. His story was retold in magazines, documentaries, and late-night television. Letters poured in from admirers, aspiring con artists, and even fans who saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood. The world wasn't disgusted by Christophe Rocancourt. It was fascinated by him, and he knew that when he got out, he wouldn't be just another ex-con. He would be a brand. As the days in his cell passed, Christophe was already planning his next con. Not with fake identities, not with forged documents, but with his own story. Because the greatest scam of all? Turning crime into entertainment. When the prison doors swung open, Christophe Rocancourt didn't walk out as a broken man. He walked out as a celebrity. The world had moved on, but his legend had only grown. He wasn't just a con artist anymore. He was a myth, a symbol of deception so bold it became entertainment. But what would he do next? Would he disappear into obscurity, living quietly under a new alias? Number. Because Christophe Rocancourt wasn't just a con artist, he was a storyteller. Within months of his release, Christophe was making more money legally than he had ever stolen. He wrote a book about his life, a tell-all memoir that sold thousands of copies. The very people he had deceived, the rich, the powerful, the curious, were now paying to hear his secrets. He gave interviews, appearing on talk shows, charming audiences with his wit and arrogance. Instead of hiding from the spotlight, he embraced it, and people ate it up. He lectured on deception, branding himself not as a criminal, but as a master of persuasion. Businessmen, aspiring con artists, and even law enforcement officers wanted to learn from him. Christophe had turned the game inside out. The very world that once hunted him now rewarded him for his genius. But did he truly go straight? For a while, it seemed like he might. He married, had a child, and tried to enjoy the luxury of legitimacy. But a man like Christophe Rocancourt could never fully step away from the game. In 2009, filmmaker Catherine Breillat accused him of swindling her out of 700,000 euros, exploiting her illness and trust. He was arrested, convicted of abuse of weakness, and sentenced to prison again. In 2014, he was caught in another scandal: bribery, fake passports, and illegal visas. He had tasted the legal life, but it was never enough. Because in the end, it was never about money. It was about the thrill, the rush of reinventing himself, of walking into a room and convincing people he was exactly who they wanted him to be. Where is Christophe Rocancourt now? Some say he's laying low, avoiding the mistakes of the past. Others believe he's still out there, spinning a new story, finding new marks, playing a new game. But one thing is certain: the greatest con artists never truly disappear. They just change their names.